When you think about death, what is the first question that comes to your mind? For me, why can I not live forever? Why does death matter? Are they the same for everyone? Why do people die? Wait, let's start from the beginning. What does death mean?
Death, the total cessation of life processes that eventually occurs in all living organisms.
So there is no more life after death? But what about an afterlife? So death is a new way of life. But how can a new way of life produce so much grief? But there's also joy. Can death be an emotion? Is it even human?
Have any of you seen death before? It seems as if no one has seen death, likely because no one who has died has been able to tell us about it. Becker argues that the fear of death is universal, a fear that influences all others and to which no one can escape. After doing a semester of death studies, I arrived at the following reflection. Do we fear death because no one truly knows what it is or what, if anything, comes after it? Studies have shown that fear of death is associated with intolerance for uncertainty, emphasizing how interventions that look to understand the meaning of this process can increase our tolerance and help us live a better life. This is why I will evaluate the 3 tasks completed during the semester and explain how these analyses allow me to develop my own definition for death, as a way to decrease my own fear towards it. The formal definition does not only explain death in terms of a total cessation of life processes, it also acknowledges that there's a lot of mystery and superstition around what death actually is. For me, death is the end of the last breath. The kind of breath that goes beyond the definition of the Cambridge Dictionary. In this journey, I will explain how I developed this idea with the recreation of the 9 contemplations of Buddhism, moving to the development of my own death symbol, to finalize with my visit to the cemetery. To achieve this, we're going to see how concepts as transience, authenticity, and memory are relevant. My reappreciation of the 9 Buddhist contemplations focused mainly on the concepts of transience and authenticity. This allowed me to start thinking about how death and life are intertwined, and gave me my first insights into developing my theory of death as the end of the last breath. Coming from a Catholic background, I learned that death's role is to exist as the final judge that will evaluate my previous actions to determine whether I have a place in hell or heaven. From my understanding, I should not fear death as long as I have behaved well according to God's rules, or die humble and show real signs of remorse when my final day arrives. This can explain why, before doing my first communion, when I was around 10 years old, I had to tell all my sins to a priest of my school. Having had the opportunity to learn more about different religions and philosophies have made me question this practice, especially the purpose of death. Death goes beyond being the final state of judgment of our existence. From what I learned in Buddhism, death can also be seen as a key element that shapes our daily lives, helping us live more meaningfully and eventually reach enlightenment or nirvana. When I did my seminar task, I was inspired by the idea of a spiritual preparation, a chance of liberation, a chance of living with authenticity, which is also explained by Heidegger in the way that death is no longer seen as an obstacle, but something that makes life more meaningful. From my understanding, this was the original Buddhist contemplation's aim. Similarly, when I did my reappreciation of the 9 Buddhist contemplations, I also focused on how to acknowledge death in order to then think of life in a more meaningful way. For the first contemplation, for example, my contemplation was very similar to the original one in terms of how it focused on acknowledging our mortality and how everyone who lives will eventually die. I associated this idea specifically with how people are like ants that can be stepped over at any time. Back then, I wanted to use the idea of the ant to explain how mortality is also greatly fragile and vulnerable. However, I now realize that the deeper meaning is how both emphasize the idea of transience. Ants are known by having a short lifespan. Our mortality is not eternal. That's why I use the word transience, specifically to explain how our life is just a temporary state of existence. This was the first time I actually began to think over the idea of death as the end of a breath, because in reality, a breath seems a simple, small gesture, a gesture that can be almost imperceptible if no one notices. However, because it has an end, it becomes significant. We might wonder if behind that breath there wasn't a story, hidden passions, desire, wishes. We care for that breath because of its fragility and how it represents the idea of transience. It's not eternal, that's why we care. From the second contemplation, I differ from the original ones and start to develop a new way of approaching the idea of death. So instead of focusing on how the lifespan is ever decreasing, my reappreciation moved closer to understanding why does the end of this life matters. Why does the end of the breath make us want to hold upon that breath? When I wrote my own contemplation, I wanted to question that if there's no meaning for life, then why should we care whether our lifespan is decreasing or not? Nonetheless, after reflecting on the 4 contemplations I made, I realized that whether existence has an ultimate meaning or not, it is irrelevant. For Buddhism, the meaning is in whether we have a more conscious death rather than intensively looking for the meaning of existence itself. Garces Foley explained how this religion has been known by promoting how to have a good death. And it is likely that the universe itself is not concerned with life having meaning. Rather, these are questions that I and many others might ask because we're social beings. Because we get deeply affected when the people we love are about to have their last breath. Even when we know we have no real power over death, we still try to do everything we can to hold on to that final breath just for a little longer. In my contemplations, I mistakenly focus on how to find meaning in life under so much uncertainty, when it is my fear of life's transience that actually makes me want to value human connections more deeply. By doing this reflective task, I have been able to accept that death will come either way. The breath will simply end, whether there was a hidden story or not. Different to the first 4 contemplations, the 5th and the 6th contemplation actually relate in a great manner to the original Buddhist contemplations, at least on how they aligned with the ideas in terms of the fragility of life and body and how it's transient just as a breath. For example, a death open to many causes also implies a life full of possibilities on how this life works in terms of a balance, combining pleasure and suffering, all integrated into this cycle of life, which actually aligns with the aims of Buddhism. Likewise, a body that is fragile and vulnerable likely implies that perfection is not going to exist, is not going to be eternal, it's going to be temporal, that there will be a moment where it will reach an end. This especially reminds me about the portrait of Dorian Gray from Oscar Wilde, where even though it looks like the body of the protagonist is always young and perfect, hidden in a portrait, time shows how the body and the mind of the person have actually decayed over time. Again, nothing is eternal or perfect, not an ant, not a breath, not mortality. Lastly, for contemplation 7 to 9, I use the original contemplations as inspiration to know what actions would I like to take in the future to live more authentically. While the original one focused on the lack of resources, I propose reappreciating the importance of my own values and experiences. Now I know that even those values might not mean anything for death itself, but they make that breath, that small gesture, more meaningful. Likewise, even if it's true that my loved ones will not save me, During that small breath, that moment of life, those loved ones were and are meaningful in my life. That's why, even if there is a chance that after death I will not see them again, I will fight for them while I am still in possession of that breath. And this is why, differently to the original contemplation, my last contemplation is about how to live more meaningfully, to make the best out of my breath. From acknowledging my mortality with ants to my last reappreciation of how the future is up to us, I try to take some ideas from the Buddhist philosophy and make them part of my daily life. Therefore, it was not until the next seminar task that I could directly portray my idea of the end of the last breath. The task was to create a new visual representation of death that could replace the Grim Reaper. This was the moment I remember asking myself, how would death look like if I die? My main aim at first was to have an illustration of death that brings security, familiarity, and authenticity, to decrease the fear towards it. This is how at first I thought death as a light. A light gives you security. It is also known by many that a light is the last thing that many people see when dying. However, if I'm looking for an expression of death that brings real security, then looking at your loved ones' faces will likely bring a higher sense of familiarity and safety. After some research, I found that some people during their last lucid moments are able to imagine those people who were most important for them. And since all organisms experience death, this means that death does not necessarily have to be a humanoid face. Animals will see different faces depending on whether they consider that face a loved one. But how can death change its face and bring safety, familiarity, and authenticity at the same time? Back then, when I was thinking on these ideas, I had recently read Paul Kalanithe's book, When Breath Becomes Air. This was likely what inspired me to think of death as a current of air, death as the end of the last breath, because air does not have a defined form. It is a type of fluid that can adjust to its container. Hence, it seemed the most appropriate response, the most authentic one. If you look for the definition of authenticity, it seems something real. However, the most significant aspect of the book is the legacy that follows after death. My representation of death had to show that legacy, that memory, the idea of memory. This is why I drew different footprints from different organisms, from the hand of a human to the footprint of a gazelle. The idea of legacy was later discussed in the units of funerals and memorials, which is why I will discuss them further on during my visit to the cemetery. Another aspect I wanted to emphasize from my illustration of death was its personality. I imagine death as it is portrayed in my favorite book, The Book Thief, from Mark Zusak. In my drawing, death is neither positive or negative, but something natural that exists wherever we go. This highly relates to the previous discussion around Buddhist contemplations and how death seems inherent in our existence, because I wanted to emphasize how death is present in both the best and the worst of humankind. This is why I drew both types of flowers around the central face. The colorful flowers represent the beauty of life, while the ones with spikes represent those moments of suffering. This highly connects with the previous task in the way that everything works as a balance, as a cycle. For me, the Grim Reaper does not represent death, as death is much more complex than what it seems. In middle school, as part of our learning of Latino American inheritance, we had to design a Mexican mask for El Día de los Muertos. And without realizing it, my drawing was not only physically similar to my mask, but the message was also the same. In the Day of the Death, people are able to meet with their ancestors in a beautiful ceremony to honor their presence and memorialize them. This was exactly the kind of feeling I wanted to convey. How the last end of a breath is not something to be afraid of, but something that almost feels familiar and that carries a legacy behind it. It makes you feel you're being true to yourself and your ancestors. This moment of enlightenment was what made me decide that the mask I did on 5th grade will be my new memento mori, as a way to remind me of my own mortality and not be afraid of it, as it will help me remember the faces of my loved ones.
I have a question. Where is the body of the symbol? Is it just like a mask and then air?
That's a good question. So, the model or symbol that I propose has this face, which is the exterior of death. It's what we recognize and what will give us security and safety. The real core of death is the end of the last breath. For me, that's where the soul of death is, the personality of death, that neutrality. It was the task that I did during my visit to the cemetery that allowed me to have this distinction between the core and the exterior. The visit to the cemetery focused mainly on memory and legacy. My most recent visit to a cemetery before the task that we had during the semester was in 2024, where me and some friends had gone to the Springvale Cemetery. It was such an interesting discovery. The truth is that we were all international students looking for a hiking place. But I really enjoyed the visit because in the past I have always avoided cemeteries. This visit made me question why was I avoiding cemeteries. When I did my task during the semester, I realized that the answer was the approach. This time the experience was greatly different. At times I even forgot that I was in the cemetery because every coffin felt as a treasure. The aim was no longer being afraid of the future, but understanding the past, understanding the legacy and memory that each person left. Every person was telling a story on its own, and as you can see in my journey, most of my annotations were drawings because I realized that the core of death is not this exterior familiar face, but the hidden stories left behind that can be unraveled. Those hidden stories represent that mysterious last breath, the one that we cherish so much. One that if you do not notice, it will pass imperceptible as any person who dies without a memory. Therefore, the aspect that impacted me the most while writing my journal was this desire for connection and legacy, the need for the last breath to not go or not pass unnoticed. The need for leaving a footprint. The best example was the statue of a man who wrote his resume and had not even died yet. That is why in my journey I wrote this famous song from Hamilton, the musical, Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story. Learning about death did not only remove my fear to cemeteries as my chief change towards trying to understand each breath, but also show me the value of legacy. It is important to visit cemeteries time to time to remind ourselves of our mortality and how do we want to be remembered by our peers, because this idea is inherent to our nature. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Each symbol, each statue show us some of these people's identity. Based on this is that we can live more authentically, since it is based on what we do alive, what will likely be remembered when we die. It's the breath what we remember, not what happened after the end of the last breath. This is ultimately why my second memento mori is a Spotify playlist to remind myself of how I want to live, so I'm choosing how I want to be remembered. In conclusion, this subject was extremely valuable for me because it made me reflect on my own mortality and on the fragility of life. I took this subject thinking that by studying death more directly, I would be better prepared for it. Near the end of the semester, however, I realized how hard it is to truly prepare yourself for it, how it goes beyond philosophy, ritual, symbolism, or academic definitions. Death is not as distant as I once imagined. Perhaps it was never that far. Sometimes it is a choice a dear person might try to make. This was what ultimately made me understand my own definition of death, the end of the last breath. Because a breath is fragile. Because you might try to hold, protect, or keep it close, but ultimately it comes and goes. What remains is the opportunity given to make the most of it while it's still there, and while we still have the chance to make a difference.